Okay, so this is the whole of the cell cycle. I've already shown you mitosis in a separate video, and as you can see, this is only a very small part of the whole cell cycle. The remaining part of the cell cycle has these three stages: gap stage 1, synthesis, and gap stage 2. These three stages, which all happen after and before mitosis, are called interphase. They all combine together to form interphase. And at the end of mitosis, you have this one cell, which the contents of the cell has halved, and the DNA mass and amount has halved. So you have to try and build that back up before the cell can go through mitosis again. You need to build that all up again. So gap stage 1 of the cell cycle is when the contents of the cell is doubled. So you could say that the mass of the cell is increasing at gap stage 1. The DNA doesn't increase in mass or amount at this stage, it's just the contents. So all the organelle, the ribosomes, the mitochondria, that all happens at this stage. Then you move on to the next stage of interphase, which is synthesis stage. This is DNA replication. It all happens within synthesis stage. And this is where each of the 46 chromosomes, they are all doubled to form the identical sister chromatids. So they're all doubled and you get the sister chromatids and they form the X chromosomes. And you could say that at this stage the mass of the DNA has doubled as well. The final stage of interphase before the cell is ready for mitosis is called gap stage 2. This is a really important stage because in this stage the cell has its last chance to check that all DNA replication has happened correctly, and so that there's maybe no mutations. It can maybe fix any mutations, because if a cell had mutated and then it went on to mitosis, you've then got maybe a cancer growing. So the gap stage 2 is really important, and it's also the last stage of the cell that the cell has to maybe increase its contents in the cell, so any further growth also happens in gap stage 2. I then move on down here is a little graph I've drawn out, and this graph is really important that you know about this graph because they're very frequent in exams, and by looking at the graph you can actually tell what stage of the cell cycle the cell is in. So if this line here represents the cell mass, and this line here represents the DNA mass. So in this stage here, the cell mass is increasing to double. So you know it must be an interphase because in mitosis it halves. So you know the cell must be an interphase if the cell mass has increased to double. To make that more specific, you can look at the DNA mass. At this part, the DNA mass has stayed the same. So you must know that the cell cycle is at gap 1 stage, because at gap 1 the DNA does not increase in amount or mass. So this shows gap 1 stage. At this stage, the DNA mass has doubled, it's gone up to 2, it's doubled, which means it must be at synthesis stage, because at synthesis stage is when the DNA doubles in mass and amount. At this stage here, you can see that both the lines drop, they fall to half. That can only be mitosis, because at mitosis, after mitosis, one cell has split into 2. The DNA mass has halved for one cell, and the organelle mass, so the contents of the cell, has also halved. This shows mitosis here. It then happens again, so you can see the almost identical way the graph is here shows the cell cycle happening again. Gap 1 stage happening here, synthesis happening here, gap 2 stage happening here.